Welcome back to the Cheap Heat Productions podcast. Okay, welcome back to the show. And today I've got a man he's a biographer, a writer, an author, Mr. Ian Douglas. How are you today, man?
Doing well, Maurice. Thank you so much for having me here.
No problem, man. We're gonna talk about a little bit of your work and why it kind of fits in with kind of several guests I'd have on this show as well. But to start things off, anyway, just want to know a bit about yourself and how did you decide that you wanted to go into this field, and just a bit of background maybe on your education.
Oh, sure. I've been an avid wrestling fan for the bulk of my life, ever since 85, 86, when my parents weren't quite aware that I was developing an interest in wrestling yet. And I would sneak off to watch whenever I got an opportunity. As far as education is concerned, a bachelor's degree is from the University of Michigan. Brief period of time at the Specs Howard School of Broadcast Arts, that's in Southfield, Michigan. Graduated from Northwestern University with a master's degree in journalism, was a reporter for NBC News in Flint, Michigan, briefly. Presently a writer for Mel Magazine, primarily in the areas of health and fitness, also chief communications officer for XL Plus International, a publicly traded plasma gasification company, and just completed my executive MBA at the Quantic School of Business and Technology.
So you've got a lot going on right now.
Always have a lot going on, and I wouldn't have it any other way. When I have moments to kick back and relax, that's when I panic the most. As far as getting involved in the field of writing, or the area, I should say, of writing about wrestling, that happened in 2016 when I was assisting the Meyer State Games of Michigan with some blog posts related to athletics. I'm a Michigan native. I thought it would be a good idea, if possible, to interview Dan Severn. And when I went into the interview thinking that if I could just get Severn for 15 minutes, he would be able to adequately cover everything I needed out of him. And he stayed on the phone with me for an hour and a half. He was very profusive with the content, and I just thought, man, if I could get him for a dozen or so segments like that, there's probably a book's worth of content there. And Severn stayed in touch, and at one point we had that conversation, and I told him if he gave me an hour or so a day for 2 weeks, we could get a book's worth of content completed. That's what we did, and that resulted in The Realest Guy in the Room, The Life and Times of Dan B. Severn.
What exactly was it that you required off of Dan that initial time you talked to him for the project?
Oh, I'm sure it was. I'd have to think back on the specifics of the blog post. I'm quite positive it no longer exists, but it was probably along the lines of the attributes it takes to be an effective amateur wrestler or to be effective in combat sports. The audience for these posts was primarily high school aged kids, the type of folks who would have been competing in a sports festival of that nature.
Mm-hmm. You touched on it there earlier that you watched wrestling, but you kind of alluded that maybe your parents didn't know. Was wrestling kind of a taboo thing in the 80s over in the States? Was it kind of frowned upon, or?
I don't know that it was frowned upon in the States. It was certainly frowned upon in my house. With all of the it's almost like magic bullet theory. This belief that something will have a strong and immediate effect on you. And I don't know that my parents were necessarily wrong. And the first time I saw Randy Savage drop an elbow off the top rope on somebody, I went into my bedroom and started dropping elbows on my stuffed animals. So they weren't entirely wrong about that. But they very quickly they saw the physicality. They decided they didn't want I think they made the decision when I was 7 or 8. They didn't want their 7 or 8-year-old son to be violently flinging things around the room or the house, the power of suggestion. So wrestling viewing was, for all intents and purposes, banned in our household until I was about 12 years old. So really only a 4 or 5 year period, but that by no means did that prevent me from sneaking off to watch it every Saturday and Sunday. They couldn't monitor me all the time.
The only people that don't understand wrestling are the people that do not watch it. And then for anyone that does watch it, they understand. But I get the feeling that the people that don't watch it and don't understand, especially here in Ireland, will be like, but that's fake. That's the kind of attitude that you get from non-wrestling fans, that it's fake. And then my comeback to that is, this is a TV show. I said, do you watch The Walking Dead, or what do you watch? Like, that's your TV show. That's not real. They're not real zombies. I'm sorry to break it to you.
That kind of way. Maurice, I've got to be completely honest with you. When I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, I thought it was 100% real.
Of course.
And
of course you would at that age.
And that was the joy of it. And I was able to develop an appreciation for it as a performance art when I got older and was able to accept and acknowledge that it was in fact a performance art. But that's what informed my fandom from that point on.
Yeah. And in terms of meeting Dan then in 2016 and making the book with him, did you have any other books released before that book? This is your first one?
Very first.
And did you ever imagine that your first book that's going to be published is going to be pro wrestling? Or was that something ever in your mind?
Oh, man. It certainly would have been a dream of mine to write anything wrestling related and to have my name permanently affixed to it and to be acknowledged as a wrestling writer. I was definitely the guy in 1999, 2000, 2001, who was sitting in the computer lab at the University of Michigan reading a Death Valley Driver video review board, writings of Dean Rasmussen and Phil Schneider when I should have been studying and doing my homework. But those guys were very inspirational to me. They were clever, they were funny, they were knowledgeable. And, but at that point, it would have been just a dream to write about wrestling. Now, with that being said, when I was at Northwestern University living in the Chicago area, I was able to cover Windy City wrestling events to a degree. Yeah. And that was considered part of the education student reporting experience. But as far as me writing a book, period, no, never. I never thought that I'd have the discipline, and I never thought I'd have the substance and the wealth of content to be able to write a book. Because if we're being honest, and this is going to sound somewhat cruel, but most people I meet even now who talk about writing, if they hear that I've helped interesting people write their autobiographies, almost invariably they'll say, "Oh, I've been thinking about writing a book." I never say this to their face, but more often than not, they shouldn't. They're thinking about one interesting aspect of their lives that will probably, if they really drew it out, they'd fill 20, maybe 30 pages with, that they're writing it in a really distended form. Mm-hmm. And now I'm wondering what they're going to fill the other 270 pages with. So most people flat out shouldn't. And fortunately, professional wrestlers, they do lead by their very essence such interesting lives, unparalleled in some respects. Every aspect of them, from the time they get into the business, like breaking in, moving from territory to territory, interactions with fans, maintaining kayfabe, that there's really nothing else to compare it to, and you can very easily fill anywhere from 300 to 500 pages with content.
Funny enough, when I first started doing this podcast, I was kind of planning out. I was trying to plan out. I didn't want to just start it and be kind of, oh, here's an episode, and then maybe a couple of weeks later, here's an episode. So what I've been doing is, I started in October 2019, and I've done at least 2 episodes per week up until now, which is, what is it, February? I can never remember dates since this pandemic as well. So it's about nearly a year and a half. So when I first started it, I was lucky enough to get a nice collection of people, including Butterbean as one of my first guests, and I had him on. And funny enough, a couple of weeks after I released the Butterbean episode, Dan Severn obviously must have seen it on Facebook, because he messaged me and he said, oh, I see you had Butterbean on your show, and do you want to tell me a bit about your show and how many viewers you have and that kind of thing? Now, at the time, I didn't really have that many, so I just sent him an honest thing. I sent, this is what I got, Dan, sent it over to him, but he never really replied. But he still took an interest to it and seen it, and maybe as the channel has grown, I will hit him back up again some point, and he might come on and talk to me.
I'll gladly advocate on your behalf to help get him on the show. He wrestled Butterbean in an MMA contest, and Butterbean is a fellow, I think, mid-Michigan guy, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm sure Dan follows Butterbean with some sort of interest.
Yeah, I think those guys probably do a lot of conventions and stuff together in the crossover at MMA and boxing world and stuff like that. So, yeah. The reception to the book when it came out, what was it like? Were you happy with it?
I wasn't happy with the book. If I'm being quite honest, and it's not that the content isn't. I recall a quote from my childhood, the great Detroit Pistons coach, Chuck Daly, of course, I'm a Metro Detroit guy, so I'm going to reference the Detroit Pistons. But he made the comment when the Pistons went to their first NBA Finals and lost, and then came back the next year and won it. He said, the first time you go through a process, you're just dying for it to be over. And then it's only once it's over that you truly understand what the process is, what you should have done, and then how you would attack it again. And when I first got involved with Severn and the writing of this book, I was thinking, okay, I'm on the hook to do this. Now, how do I do it? And I was figuring it out as I went. We did not have a publisher lined up. We wound up signing with What Culture right around the time that What Culture was going through this massive shift in terms of who was working for them. In fact, I won't say his name in case there are any issues, but the gentleman with What Culture who was putting the majority of their books together at the time, I think he was quickly shifted out of there shortly after the editing of the book was supposed to have been completed.
Okay.
So the book did not receive the level of promotion from What Culture that we would have initially expected it to. That's just the sort of thing that happens when you have that degree of turnover going on.
Yeah.
But more to the point, there were a lot of typos in the book.
Okay.
There were a lot of typos, and Dan and I worked on a draft that we thought was completely edited. We thought that the editor, imagine that the editor over at What Culture was going to do a thorough editing job following that, and a lot of typos still remained in the book. Something that I'm frankly ashamed of, not only because it doesn't reflect particularly well on me, but Dan's name is the name on the book. So I get another bite at the apple. Dan and I may actually be working on another book, and I can correct that, correct those oversights. But yes, if I had to do it all over again, I would have followed the model that I've taken with subsequent projects, which is to take my time. There's absolutely no rush in getting these things completed. There's no rush in putting them out. You should take the time, be thorough, make sure the story is told, assume you only get one bite at the apple, and put out the project that you, as a wrestling fan, would be satisfied in receiving and saying, this is money well spent.
Yeah. But then if you look at the first book, obviously, and if I look back even at my first episode, when I used to do these podcasts, I was recording on an iPhone on my kitchen table. Now I got a different computer to do it. And the way I'm thinking about it is, if I look back to a year ago, I'd be like, that doesn't really look great. That doesn't really sound great. How do I better that? And I suppose it's the same with writing, is it? You have to always try and better your last project.
Absolutely. And it helps when you make great connections with people who know what they're doing. Yeah. It was during that time. And again, I also encourage people, if they have an opportunity to do something, even if the financial reward to you is zero, if you have the time to do something for the first time and an opportunity presents itself, the correct answer is almost always yes, because of the experience you'll gain through doing it, because of the connections you'll make as a result of having done it. It almost always behooves you to take up the challenge. So with that lead in, just over the course of working on the first book, I met Kenny Bevan, also known as Kenny Casanova, who has put out the books of Kamala, Brutus Beefcake, Tito Santana, Vader, and a host of other people. And we got to the point in a couple years later in 2018 when I was working on Bugsy McGraw's book, and I was going to be publishing that one myself. And when Kenny learned that, he would say, okay, go watch a video on how to format a book yourself. Go read a document on how to prep photos for a book and how to drop them into the text yourself. Now go look up how to do the sizing. Now go look at how to get your own ISBN, and how to modify the cover if you absolutely had to. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, you become a one-stop shop. You become the book publisher all on your own. And you start to learn that you don't need to go to the major publishers to get any of these things done. You don't want to be the helpless guy turning in a manuscript and saying, okay, now please make this look acceptable for me. You're better off if you can do it yourself. And so I credit Kenny for that a great deal. And I also credit my very good friend Oliver Bateman, because he's the gentleman who writes the exquisite and thorough obituaries for The Ringer, for all that are always very meticulously researched. And he has written and evaluated and scrutinized every wrestling biography or autobiography that he can get his hands on. And so he's an excellent resource to bounce ideas off of. And also he's a wonderful guy to just you send a first draft to, for instance, and have him evaluate it, because he's read absolutely everything and he knows what makes a good wrestling autobiography.
Yeah, it reminds me what you're saying there about kind of being able to do what you can yourself at home about guys I'll be talking to in the music industry that maybe 10, 15 years ago they had to go to a studio. Now they can nearly record an album in their own house. Like, it's nearly the same thing.
Yes, 100%. And it becomes something that you take pride in. And now I only go to, like, for instance, Brian's book. I certainly, oh, there we go. I certainly can't draw this well.
Yeah.
And so I went to Mr. Leitzel to help put the cover art together for me. But aside from that, everything between the cover is 100% written or inserted into the book by me. And there's also a lot of pressure that comes with that, because, you know, in the case of the What Culture, I'll call it, debacle with Dan's book, I take ownership of that from the standpoint that the project was rushed, and I have to say that I had a hand in getting the project rushed to print. But aside from that, now I'm in a position where if there's one jot or tittle, so to speak, in the book that's out of place, it is 100% my fault, and the buck stops here. And if anyone sees anything that's incorrect, yeah, come complain to me, because it's my fault.
Yeah. Do you rather that kind of pressure, or is it pressure, or do you prefer having it in your own hands, kind of?
I do. One of the difficulties with going to a publisher, and I'll use my friend John Plombon as an example. He's the gentleman who wrote the book on the UWF and Herb Abrams that just came out. I think it came out in September of last year, and he was on Facebook in 2020 lamenting that he had a 430-page book, mostly that had a lot of original interviews with UWF stars, and also moment by moment write-ups on every UWF show that has ever been recorded. A lot of great information throughout the book. This 430 pages long, and he spoke with a few literary agents and publishers who said, you need to chop this down to 300 pages, and then maybe we'll take a look at it. And I went to him, and you know, there are some projects. This isn't to say that there aren't some projects that can benefit from being condensed. But if you've taken the trouble to write the book and you stand by every word or bit of punctuation that's in it, and it's 430 pages long, and you decide that that's the length it should be, if you have to take it to a literary agent or a publisher who's going to tell you that it needs to be reduced by more than 25%, that is a deep cut.
Yeah.
And I advised him, you know, also sorry, there are too many thoughts going through my head at once.
You're correct.
But you get into the, by the time you take it to a literary agent, and you get feedback, and they start shopping the book, just to get it to the point where they'll finally start shopping it, that could be 6 months to a year. Getting it into the hands of a publisher, and then the publisher saying that edits and revisions need to be completed, that can take another 6 months to a year. Or if you've made the decision that everything is as it should be, you can take it to a publisher, or you can put it out in a glorified self-published manner while still making sure that everything is as it should be, and you can set your own publication date, and you can put it out when you want to put it out. So that's what, especially for wrestlers or people who are writing wrestling related books, you can find your audience. They're very neatly arranged in groups on Facebook or other blog sites online, you can very easily find them. You can very easily market your book to them, and you don't need to rely on a publisher who's going to pay you $1 per copy against an advance when the book comes out, as opposed to the $10 per copy you can make selling it yourself.
Yeah. In terms of Dylan Hornswoggle, how did you guys meet to do the book, and did he approach you to do it?
The day after I finished the final interview with Severin,
okay,
I decided to go to the gym for the first time in 2 weeks. Yeah. And as I was on the elliptical, I was listening to an episode of Stone Cold Steve Austin's podcast. It happened to be, I think it was Dylan's first interview after his release. Yeah. And I was listening to it, and I could not stop laughing. I thought it was hilarious when he was talking about his early time in the Indies in Wisconsin and Illinois, wrestling a short stack, the man, the myth, the midget. I remember that cracked me up. I got off the elliptical. I went back to the Airbnb that I was staying in Virginia. My now wife, then fiance, was living in. Actually, she wasn't quite my fiance yet. She was a month away from being my fiance. She was living in DC at the time, and I was living in that area visiting her. But I went back to the Airbnb, got on Twitter, found his booking email, sent him a message, told him I was in the process of working on Severin's book, but I thought his story was incredible and I'd like to help him get it to print. Went, took a shower, came back, checked my email. Excuse me. He had already replied and said he would be interested. And within 2 weeks, we were up and running and starting the first round of interviews for his book.
Yeah. And that obviously went down very well then, that book, didn't it?
Yeah. But that is a case where two things. Number one, that was a book that I thought needed to be taken to a serious publisher. And I went the literary agent route. And I wasn't sure what level of completeness the book needed to be in. And it was probably between 350 and 400 pages, all things considered. But I wasn't sure what stage of completeness it needed to be in before it was taken to a literary agent. And the literary agent got it, and they started the process of shopping it around. And it took a year. And when they got it over to ECW Press wanted it greatly condensed. And they had their own guy who'd worked on Bob Holly and Al Snow's books, who was tremendous. It's Ross Owen Williams. And he took the reins at that point, and he was responsible for fashioning Dylan's story into the 300-page version that got released. And Ross did a phenomenal job with it.
Yeah. In terms of yourself then, have you been writing much during the last couple of years with the pandemic and things, or have you any projects that you have coming up?
Oh, man.
Ones that you could talk about.
Well, okay. Well, with the last couple of years, Brian Blair and I started writing his autobiography in, it was May or June. I think it was June of 2020. And that's when, it helps to know people. Kenny Casanova messaged me and said, the writer of Brian Blair's autobiography is looking to dump the project. He wants to do other things. That gentleman's name was Scott Stevens. Kenny recommended me to Brian and Scott as the writer for that project. I'd already spoken with Brian on a couple of occasions because he contributed He contributed the afterword to Bugsy McGraw's autobiography, Brute Power, for me.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was a very hard sell at that point. I spoke with Scott, spoke with Brian. They were both on board with having that transition made. And from that point on, I spoke with Brian 3 times a week, 1 hour each time, from the beginning of June through, I think, the end of September. And it was during that period where we accumulated the bulk of what would be his story. And there are always other stories that need to be added in later on. But we finally had a first draft completed probably January or February of 21.
Yeah.
And then we worked through another couple drafts. We got, I say we, like I can take any credit. Brian got Hulk Hogan, Steve Keirn, and Bret Hart to provide forwards and afterwards for the book. And then the book was subsequently released in October of 21. So yes, that was quite a bit of writing that I was doing during the pandemic, and also tangentially related to this, only because of some of the material I've been able to write. I was picked up as the primarily health and fitness writer for Mel Magazine. But Josh Schollmeyer is the editor of the magazine, and he happens to be a huge pro wrestling fan. So when I pitched whenever I pitch something wrestling related, he'll usually give it a fair look. But when I pitched that it was the 40th anniversary of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, he said, yeah, go talk to Dave Meltzer. And so I contacted Dave Meltzer, and Dave was happy to oblige. And we got a 40 years of Dave's remembrances, and he gave a thorough review of what he believes his influence has been on the wrestling industry over the years and what changes he's seen during that time.
Man, that's very interesting. If I was to mention to you, you could pick one person to write a book with in the wrestling industry, who would it be?
Oh my goodness. Alive or dead?
We'll say alive.
Alive. It's okay. It's not realistic to say The Rock, for instance.
Why not?
Why not? I know that the Bugsy McGraw book wound up at his house because his mother asked for a copy to be sent there. So I walked that one over to the post office and sent it to The Rock's house in California. That was nice. That was pretty cool. But yeah, having a thorough 600-700 page autobiography of The Rock, covering from infancy through his time in Hollywood, that would be a dream project to work on. Also having, and now that I've spoken to him, I'm not attempting to put this out there as something I'm lobbying for. But now that I think about it, like all of those WWF, WWE autobiographies, really with the exception of Mick Foley's, they just had too much. They just had too much corporate oversight. They were way too condensed. They weren't satisfying, and if
they weren't personal,
right? And so somebody like Hogan, if you really gave it room to breathe and said, let's take this from the time of you growing up in Tampa. Let's talk once a week, even for an hour. And let's set aside an entire year to do interviews. So by the end of the year, we've got a collection of 52 interviews. And let's put out a 600 to 1,000 page Hulk Hogan autobiography covering absolutely everything, so that you feel like you've been given you feel like you've said everything you ever wanted to say about your life to your fans with no filter. I think something like that would be incredible. But even in saying that, other people who sort of got shafted by the WWE book system, Kurt Angle is another one. He's told me himself he thought his book sucked. Well, I would be thrilled to work with Kurt on correcting that error.
Yeah, and he's got obviously a massive story with the Olympics, the neck break. Like, there's so much things in there as well,
Yeah.
And Steve Austin?
I exchanged emails with Steve Austin a week ago after I'll tell you, it's absolutely stupid how these things go. I'll just say this: I was given a distribution list by Kenny of people that when you're putting your own book out, you can put your own press releases out. Here's a curated list of people who might be interested in amplifying that message and helping you reach a larger audience. So there were emails on that list that I had no idea who they went to. I just sent it out, and I've been sending stuff to this email distribution list for years. And when I put the Meltzer interview out, I received a response from Steve Austin saying he appreciated the read. And then we exchanged a few more emails, and he said he'd be interested in reading Brian's book. So I sent one to him. But then you go back and you look at the you look at the email address and the way it's constructed. And you're like, oh yeah, that's what that means. Like that makes sense that would be Steve Austin's email address. So yeah, I would love to do Steve Austin's book. It's not going to happen. Those guys are too big. They have access to the cream of the crop in terms of writers and ghostwriters, period. And I'll be frank about it. I'm just happy to be here. That's not to say that I can't help someone write a competent autobiography. I think at this stage I've proven that I'm capable of doing so. But I'm just happy to be involved because you grow up as a wrestling fan. You're a kid. I'm 6 years old watching my first Killer Bees match on television, and never dreaming that 30 plus years later I'd have an opportunity to help Brian Blair write his autobiography. And you're forever linked to these guys at that point. So it's a dream and a privilege just to be involved with their projects.
Yeah, you've kind of come full circle from the childhood to where you are now. And listen, Ian, I really appreciate your time on the show today. Thanks so much.
Maurice, it was a true pleasure. I'd be happy to come back, and I'd be happy to advocate to get any number of other people on this show with you.
What we'll do is we'll catch up when you have another project coming out, and we'll see how you're going.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Cheers, man.